Alright, here we go. Finally, I need to sit down and just do this. The Rendition Verite. Wait, what? What is a Rendition Verite? Well, there are plenty of videos that go in depth into the Rendition Verite 1000, but in short, it was the very first video card to run Quake with 3D accelerated graphics back in 1996. Come the year 1998, 3DFX released the Voodoo 2, which dramatically increased the performance of the original Voodoo Graphics PCI card and put Rendition in a bad situation. You see, Rendition had just managed to release the Verite Series 2000 in the end of 1997, but the Voodoo 2 offered close to twice the performance of the Verite 1000, and although the Verite 2000 series did improve considerably on the V1000, its reign only lasted through the end of 1997 to the beginning of 1998, when the Voodoo 2 was released. While 3DFX processed Z-buffer on their cards, in case of the Voodoo 1 and 2 with the frame buffer interface, the Rendition Verite V1000 did not process Z-buffer on the card, and that means that with the Rendition card, the Z-buffer is read by software. So even though that fault was addressed by the Verite 2000 series, all the games released prior to this already worked with the original architecture, so the performance was still limited by the old design that offloaded Z-buffer parentheses depth information to the CPU. Okay, so the CPU is doing more work. And considering we are running a 486 today, this might be a problem. The Pentium MMX line was released in early 1997, and I'm guessing a lot of people were still using early Pentiums and late 486s when the Rendition Verite Series 2000 came out. Now, I'll admit that even Voodoo cards have little to offer us performance boosters for 486 computers, as I have tested in a prior video on the channel. And the frame rate is so low that the Metro card that takes you to the beginning of the game can't do it. It gets stuck on a spinning loop for lack of frames. But it's been a curiosity of mine to see if a Rendition Verite can give a 486 a performance boost, so why not? So let's take a look at this right now. I have here the fastest 486 released. It's AMD's 5X86 that runs at 133 MHz. Mine is clocked at 160, so faster than any retail 486. And it's all nicely packed in a rusty case, giving it its name of the Rust Bucket. If any 486 can push a Verite, this is it. The counterpart of this video is of course the Rendition Verite. This one is not the original 1000 series, this was released a couple of years later in 1997. It's the Rendition Verite 2100 released by Diamond. You could say that a 486 is not ideal to run a 3D video card, and you would be right. But I don't think this combination was out of the realm of possibilities, considering that this 486 was released in December of 1995 and this video card was released in 1997, so they're less than 2 years apart. I have installed some DOS games in the Rust Bucket. And since the original title released for the Verite was V-Quake, a version of Quake specifically developed for the Verite, we can start with that. Considering this build was done for the Verite 1000, I didn't think much of it, but man does the Rendition perform here. The Rust Bucket does pretty good in software mode for a 486, but take a peek at what that looks like without relying on 3D acceleration. I did bump the resolution from 320 by 200 to 320 by 240, because that's what works best with the Rendition in this game. I know I can get about 14 FPS with the Rust Bucket in Quake if I use the right 2D video card and overclock the bus frequency, like we did on the 486 Quake race video. But what do we get with the rendition by just putting it in there? Besides bilinear filtering, anti-aliasing, and 16-bit color that all make things look much more clear, we get the retro playable rate of 22 frames per second. Pretty impressive to me. When it comes to early 3D acceleration, Descent 2 is another classic. The Rust Bucket does a pretty good job on it in softer mode. The game runs smoothly, but textures are not the best. The game kinda looks like a big mess of pixels. In 3D with the rendition, well, what do we have here? Smooth high definition 3D accelerated graphics in a 486. This is a bit subjective, but I think the game suffers from some slowdowns in frame rate when running the Verite version, but it's definitely worth it for the high definition smooth textures. One thing I noticed is that there's a magenta tone to the game in the Verite version. Don't know if it's anything with my hardware. I don't think so, because this is the only game that I had that happen to. Next up, we have NASCAR Racing from Papyrus. Results weren't so impressive with this one, but pretty good. Once more, the Rust Bucket does a pretty good job with the game in softer mode. You can choose between the resolutions of 320 by 200 and 640 by 480. Needless to say, the 46 does not do a very good job in 640 by 480 in softer mode. In the Verite mode, the game only gives you the option of running in 640 by 480, and it improves quite a bit in that resolution, but it's lower than in low res using softer rendering, and that's a trade-off you have to deal with. The game has an interesting performance scaling option where it turns off certain details when frame rates drop. So pretty cool for the time, but even when it disables everything, it's still slow when racing amidst all the other cars. This might be an issue with the 46 that is actually performing so well that sometimes I forget it's only a 46. Now we start getting into the really high notes with the rendition and the 486. Rebel Moon has no software emulation mode. It was made for the rendition and bundled with the Creative Labs 3D Blaster PCI. Luckily, it works with my Vérité V2100. All of these DOS games were originally made for the Vérité 1000, so it's necessary to run a fix on the executable called V2DOS fix, but besides that, it's mostly a smooth experience. To be fair, Rebel Moon crashed a couple of times, maybe because it was made for the 3D Blaster PCI, or because it requires something newer than a 486. The game looks great though. Again, it's hard to believe it's being run on a 486. When you walk into large areas of the map, the lack of floating point math performance of the 486 shows a bit, but the game is still playable. Tomb Raider is another high point of this experiment. The Rust Bucket does a formidable job in low-res, softer rendering. As you can see, the game is playable. But with the Verite, the game looks gorgeous. This is another title that really impressed me. I was expecting something, but not that the game would look this good. Performance suffers in large parts of the map as usual, but it's still playable. I'm sure my kid self would love to play this regardless of the performance in large areas. Another impressive result for the not so common combination of a 46 and a Rendition Vérité V2100. So the results in DOS gaming speak for itself, and I could end the video here, but that would leave out a big part of the story. You see, the rendition uses the Speedy 3D API for DOS gaming, and it uses the RRedline for Windows gaming. So let's take a look at some RRedline API accelerated games before we wrap this up. Now here we're pushing it. Quake 2 was definitely never intended to be played in a 486. It seems that the Verite version was kind of something put together in the last minute because you can't actually choose the Verite rendering option in the menus. So what you do is you drop down the console and type in the command to start the Rendition Vérité version. So the rendition does improve visuals and playability. I realize this is becoming a trend here, but although it's impressive, it doesn't do the miracle of making this game playable on the 486. Nevertheless, it was cool enough that the computer managed to open the game and run it in any manner. Rendering it in software mode, it's more of a slideshow, but it's to be expected. The resolution for both video modes is set to 400 by 300. I thought it looked a bit more reasonable than 320 by 200. Unfortunately, there's no full screen mode at 400 by 300, but I tested it in full screen in other video modes and I don't see a difference in performance. When running the time demo with the Verite, you get close to 10 FPS, and that's about double what you get by rendering it in software mode. Next game we have is Subculture. This Ubisoft game is cute, seems like it's analogous to Archimedean Dynasty, but this one can run either using Glide or Redline. Not much to say here, the game runs pretty well to the extent I played it. Definitely a worthwhile experience with the 486 and the rendition card, and to me it was another impressive result. Die by the Sword is a game I came across while researching games that run with the Redline API. The game looks pretty good, runs in somewhat playable way. That is until you start fighting some enemies. When there's one enemy on the screen, it's still kind of playable, but if there are two enemies or more, it breaks the old Rust Bucket 486. I think that not even my kid self would try to play the game this slow back in the 90s. What a slideshow. Furthermore, Susan, movement is a bit weird. I guess using the keyboard and mouse for gaming wasn't yet established, but once you get used to it, it's alright. Since we ran a racing game in DOS with the Speedy API, I think it's only fair to try a racing game again with the Redline API. This is Soda Off-Road Racing. It's tough to say this is playable, I don't think it's a very enjoyable experience. Also, really strange that NASCAR 2 runs kind of okay, and this, made by the same company, Papyrus, probably uses the same game engine and runs terribly bad. Might be related to the extra layer Windows 95 presents here, or simply the Redline API isn't as well optimized for slow CPUs as Speedy 3D. Like on NASCAR, you can turn a bunch of graphical details off, but then it kinda looks like an early DOS game like Stunts without the frame rate. So positives, the game runs, negatives, it's not what I call playable as far as racing games go.
Please fasten your safety belt. This is gonna be a little bit...
Monster Truck Madness turned out to be super impressive. Not because of how well the game is running, but how good it looks. For whom just played Soda Off-Road Racing, this is fantastic. Don't get me wrong, it's not perfect, but it's playable, and that's saying something for 3D accelerated racing games in the 486. Murder, Death, Kill, or just MDK is another title we can test with the Redline API. When I first opened it, I forgot to patch it for the rendition and I got the Direct3D version. And well, the rendition is supposed to be able to run games in Direct3D, but as you can see, there are missing textures and performance is not great. So after patching it to the Redline version, results are surprising. The game is mostly playable. Again, in large areas you have to be a little patient with the low frame rate, but all in all, I would love to play this game with this performance level back in the 90s. There was some good and bad in the Rendition 486 experiment. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from what you saw, and go ahead and tell me in the comments section how you feel about this. Thanks for sticking to the end, and I hope you'll enjoy this and the other videos of GPU June 2, which I'll link the playlist in the description. See you on the next one.